February 19, 1945, off the coast of Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands, North Pacific. Thomas H. Begay, a young U.S. Marine of the Navajo Nation, felt the landing craft buck in the winter swells as gray water slapped the bow and oily spray salted his lips. The engine droned, the coxswain shouted over the racket, and the smell of diesel, wet canvas, and cordite sifted through the morning haze. He checked his handset, traced a thumb along the handset cord, and rested his other hand on the compact field set cradled at his knees, its dials set by habit in the dim light. In the next craft, Marines hunched behind their packs, faces striped with grime and anticipation. To port, great columns of water leapt up from naval shells. To starboard, ships lay in files like a steel forest, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, firing in timed salvos. The shore was a low, black scarp of volcanic sand with a crouched shape rising behind it, Suribachi, already plugged by smoke. Begay worked his jaw to clear the pressure and recited silently the words that turned English orders into Navajo, then into a code no enemy had ever read. In training, he had learned to breathe against the noise, to picture the words before speaking, to keep his mind clear of fear. Now, as the ramp clanged down and sulfur wind hit his face, he went forward with the radio man's burden, boots sinking in ash-like sand, hearing the shouted word that mattered most to him: transmit. The battle that met him that morning was the product of 1,000 decisions made far from the beach. More than 70,000 Marines of the V Amphibious Corps, principally the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, had been assigned to seize Iwo Jima, a volcanic island of roughly 8 square miles lying astride air routes to Japan. On D-Day, February 19, 1945, the Navy assembled one of the largest pre-invasion bombardments of the Pacific War. 8 battleships, along with carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, shelled the island while carrier aircraft struck gun positions, ammunition stores, and airfields. Yet the defenders, roughly 21,000 Japanese under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had spent months tunneling into the island, building more than 10 miles of interconnected caves, galleries, and bunkers with camouflaged firing points that could reopen minutes after bombardment passed. The geography magnified the defense. The dark cinders of Iwo's beaches swallowed men and machines. The island's commanding ridges gave hidden gunners interlocking fields of fire. In that environment, where conventional lines of communication were broken by terrain, smoke, and shock, radio was the artery of decision. Messages had to move instantly, accurately, and in a form the enemy could not exploit. That is why, among the riflemen and flamethrower teams and stretcher bearers, the Marine divisions landed teams of Navajo code talkers, men whose voices would carry grid coordinates, target descriptions, casualty counts, resupply, requests, and sudden alerts at speeds other ciphers could not match. Within the first day and a half on Iwo Jima, Marine signal officers would tally more than 800 vital messages sent by Navajo teams without a single error recorded in transmission or interpretation. The code remained unbroken. He worked in bursts measured by breath and blast. He knelt in the lee of a sand ridge while machine gun tracers wrote thin red lines across the air, cupped the handset, and spoke in a calm cadence learned at Camp Pendleton. Words that to an outsider would sound like pure Navajo, but to another trained Marine would map exactly to letters, numbers, and pre-agreed terms. He passed a request for naval gunfire on a pillbox pinned under Suribachi's slope, then an adjustment to walk artillery 20 yards left along a trench mouth. He switched to the vocabulary of aircraft control: tracks, altitudes, drifts, calling for smoke on a draw where Marines stalled, then flipped back to logistics when his company's ammunition bearer held up his empty bandoliers. He could feel the code working even as the island fought back. Navajo had within it a structure no enemy training could mirror under wartime pressure, a phonetic alphabet with words mapped to letters: Wol La Chi for A, Be La Sana for A's alternate, and so on, plus hundreds of agreed terms, many crafted to be conjured aloud under fire and remembered when sleep and food ran thin. He had memorized lists with the steadiness drilled into him since boot camp. A bomber was a Jaisha, a dive bomber a Genie, a destroyer a Kalo. The radio man beside him nodded when the reply squawked back within seconds. The mortar rounds slurred in and burst where he had described. The squad leaders shouted and rose again, moving. The rhythm, he knew, was what kept men alive. Observe, translate, send, receive, translate, act. The story of how he came to speak those words into that handset on that black beach began years earlier, in the high desert of the American Southwest, and in conference rooms where officers studied failures. Early in the Pacific War, U.S. forces had used standard book ciphers and mechanical systems to protect radio traffic. They were secure, but slow, and their complexity could jam a battlefield at the worst moment. Enemy eavesdroppers drew value from delay itself. A fire mission ordered too late might as well be a missed. In early 1942, Marine officers in California tested an idea that had floated across the services for years: use a native language with few outside speakers as the basis for an oral code that required no mechanical encryption. After a demonstration in February 1942 at Camp Elliott near San Diego showed promise, the Marine Corps recruited a first group of 29 Navajo men, then gathered more over time until more than 400 would serve. They trained like all Marines: rifle marksmanship, fieldcraft, discipline, but layered on a specialized burden: invent, memorize, and standardize a combat code drawn from their own tongue. Early versions listed more than 200 base words, later expanded to 400 or more by the end of the war to cover ships, aircraft, weapons, ranks, months, and tactics. What made it more than merely speaking Navajo on the radio was the deliberate substitution of word pictures and the phonetic alphabet that let any word be spelled on the fly in seconds. In field trials, code talkers could send and receive messages in less than a quarter of the time required by conventional encryption. Axis codebreakers, trained in the roots and families of European languages, faced a language with no published grammar, no widespread non-native speakers, and layered substitutions that put yet another veil between sound and meaning. On paper, analysts described it as low probability of compromise. In practice, it worked under the most violent tests the war could offer. One officer would later say of Iwo Jima that without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken the island, a tribute spoken not in ceremony, but in the raw tally of messages carried in the first 48 hours. He had left home in 1943 with a duffel and a quiet resolve shaped by two worlds. As a child, he had been sent to a government school where the language of his grandparents was punished. Yet the uniform he chose to wear asked him to use that very language to save lives. He remembered the day a Marine recruiter came through, the questions asked in a classroom at Fort Wingate and at agency offices, the medical checks, the bus ride to California, and the sea air at San Diego burning his lungs after the dry country he knew. Drill instructors broke them down and built them back up with the same rituals used for all recruits: rifle pits and forced marches, cleaning gear until it flashed, learning to move when told, and to think when needed. Then, in quiet rooms at Camp Pendleton, the code talkers worked in pairs and groups to test the lists that would form their shared memory. They repeated sequences until the words came reflexively: aircraft types, ship classes, directionals for map work, numbers that flowed without hesitation. They learned to send under movement, to speak clearly when the wind rose, to choose short words to speed a message without losing accuracy. He made friends who would scatter across divisions and regiments, some to Guadalcanal and Bougainville, some to Peleliu, some to Saipan and Tinian, some, like him, eventually to the 5th Marine Division bound for Iwo Jima. At each stop, he learned the bitter arithmetic of the islands, the casualty lists published day by day, the long names of new places sprinkled with ashes, the sight of transports loading and unloading by the thousands of tons, the smell of canvas and oil that followed a Marine wherever he went. On shipboard, he drilled with the radio men, practiced circuit discipline, and learned to keep his voice steady when others shouted. He carried with him letters from home, written in careful script, and, folded in the same envelope, a short list he had copied by hand through repetition. Not the code itself, the code lived only in memory, but reminders of the order of drills that had put it there. The machine of war around him measured effort in numbers as large as any he had ever imagined. A single Marine division crossed the ocean with tens of thousands of men, hundreds of radios, thousands of rifles, and stockpiles of ammunition measured by the shipload. The Navy's bombardment before his landing had used shells by the tens of thousands, and even then, the rows of hidden guns and mortars and machine guns waited under rock. Across the Pacific, the United States had built and moved a fleet on a scale no previous war had seen. Hundreds of combatant ships and thousands of auxiliaries. New airfields carved onto coral. Repair bases that could change an engine on a carrier or rebuild a destroyer's bow while the campaign rolled on. Factories back home turned out radios and crates stacked in rows like houses, bombers and lines long as streets, and training syllabi by the ream to turn civilians into specialists. The code talkers, fewer than 500 in all branches by war's end, were a tiny fraction of the total force, yet their impact was magnified at the point where plans met ground. On Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and later at Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, their teams served with artillery battalions, infantry regiments, and headquarters companies. They built a web of speech across fire lanes and gullies and tree lines where wire could not survive. Enemy listening posts tracked American radio nets through the war, recorded voices, charted procedures, and sometimes used deception, yet never produced a workable decryption of the Navajo system. The reason was simple and stubborn: speed and structure. A message sent in 20 seconds and acted on in a minute left nothing to exploit. A language family unknown to the enemy, wrapped in substitution and drilled into mind until it could be spoken in a single breath, gave no foothold for a pen and a quiet room. On Iwo Jima, where one Marine Division signal officer counted 800 and more Navajo transmissions in 2 days without error, the evidence was not statistical argument but survival. He realized as he worked that day that the code was less a secret than a skill. He watched the officers' hands when they shaped a request, asked for clarity before the mortar teams fired, and made himself the calm in a crowded frequency band where panic could breed confusion. When his radio man changed batteries, he switched to another set without a pause. When a burst chewed the sand inches away, he kept his head over the handset so the man on the other end could hear every word. He tasted grit, saw lips crack under cinders, felt the weight of the pack strap on his shoulder. At intervals, he scratched short notes and tucked them away to write a longer letter when time allowed, knowing that censors would read them, that the language he loved could not be written on paper and code, that the burden of memory, the whole dictionary of battle, had to stay in his mind. He thought of home, of elders, of sheep grazed along a mesa rim, of the way the wind carried stories in the evening. He thought, too, of friends already gone in earlier campaigns, of a man he had laughed with at Pendleton whose grave lay somewhere on a ridge with a name that sounded like a prayer. He set those thoughts down again because the net was live and the company commander was calling for a correction to the fire, and the handset hummed in his palm with the pulse of a machine that had, for the moment, chosen to live rather than die. The wider canvas around him changed by the hour. By nightfall on February 19th, the Marines held a tenuous grip on sections of the beach and the lower ground, but fire from Suribachi and from the honeycombed heights behind the airfields raked any movement. The black sand made every foot of gain feel like a mile. Tanks bogged to their bellies. Stretchers required whole teams to lift and carry through powder that behaved like water. Over the next days, as elements of the 5th Division assaulted Suribachi and raised a flag on its summit on February 23rd, other regiments pushed north into a maze of interlocked defenses that had to be found, mapped, and killed one by one. Here, the code talker's speed showed its worth in the small, relentless math of attack. A target described in 8 words, a grid corrected by 2 digits, a shift ordered in 10 seconds, a battery swung before a machine gun could rake a new approach. Reports passed about airfields secured, supplies landed by the tens of thousands of tons, casualties counted by the hundreds and then thousands. Outside the island, carrier task forces struck the home islands and fought off air raids. B-29s used Saipan and Tinian to reach the factories of Japan. Inside, the fight consumed men at a rate that made every saved minute feel like a life handed back. In those days, a Marine signal officer who kept the tallies pinned to his map board would put into words an assessment that echoed through every code talker's memory. Were it not for the Navajo, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. It was not an ornament. It was a result measured in guns, silenced, and ground taken. He was tired in a way that crept into the bones, but the habit of precision held. He clipped syllables clean. When another Navajo voice came back on the net, he could hear the same training in the cadence, the same practice, the same rope of memory thrown across noise and fear. Together, in pairs and small teams, scattered across companies, battalions, and regiments, they maintained circuits in weather that turned men into shadows and sand into smoke. They slept in snatches with the handset on a chest, woke to a query, answered, and slept again for minutes at a time. They wrote letters home on ration boxes, folded them, and handed them to mail clerks who would ferry them back across the ocean in sacks piled by the 100,000. They ate when they could, drank when their canteens were not shot through, and learned to bless the dull thud of a case of water landing behind a dune. When the battalion shifted line, they moved the net with it, checking call signs and confirming frequencies, keeping the chain unbroken. He did what he had been trained to do: speak, listen, and keep the path between order and action open. The fact that no enemy unit ever broke the code he used was not a matter of luck. Behind it lay the years of suppression that had tried to erase his language and the stubborn survival that had kept it alive. The officers who had recognized in 1942 that speed could be a form of armor. The training that standardized and spread the vocabulary until a man in one division could understand a man in another without a second thought. And the discipline, at the point of contact, to keep the code off paper and inside the mind. It was a network built of flesh and breath and memory and tested under artillery and heat and fear. While he crouched there on the edge of Suribachi's shadow, speaking into a handset that shook with the ground, the Pacific War's larger gears turned. On other islands, men fought and died. Ships fueled at sea by the thousands of gallons. Aircraft roared off decks and landed at night. Factories in California stamped and soldered and packed. The numbers on staff charts, divisions, tonnage, sorties, casualty estimates, turned back into faces at the point where a voice made a gun move 3 degrees and a trench go quiet. His work, and the work of the few hundred like him, made that turn quicker and surer. It was a narrow, specific gift, the kind that few would see in newsreel frames. But in the places where decisions live and die, it was decisive. He did not think in grand terms when he was working. He thought in distances on the ground and the sound of a reply in his ear. He thought in the weight of a word and the way a friend's voice would carry through static. Later, much later, when men gathered to remember, when figures were added up and plaques were cast, when his hair had gone white and his hands slowed, he would sit and describe the work in plain language to anyone who asked. He would tell them about the sand, about the noise, about the way a message could change the shape of the next few minutes, and how the code they had built and carried never failed them and was never broken by their enemy. But on that morning, with the beach at his knees and Suribachi throwing smoke into the sky, he could only feel the shape of the work as a kind of stillness at the center of a very large storm. The voice went out, the answer came back, and men moved. That was enough. That was the whole reason he had practiced the lists until sleep and waking ran together. The reason. He had taken the oath and crossed an ocean. The reason he now kept his head over the handset as the island bucked and spat. He was a Marine, a Navajo, and a code talker, and on that day the code he spoke did exactly what it had been built to do. He did not remember much sleep in the days after that first landing on Iwo Jima. Only fragments of time when the roar of guns dimmed and his body folded where it sat, the handset still near his hand. The sand got into everything: gear, rations, wounds, and it clung to the sweat on his neck and under his helmet rim until his skin felt like it had turned to grit. Thomas stayed close to the company command post, sometimes no more than a shallow scrape behind a rock or a wrecked vehicle, and every hour carried the same pattern of urgency. A runner came in from a platoon leader with a map sheet smudged by charcoal fingers, or the company commander leaned over, his finger jabbing at a contour line, asking for smoke on a ridge or high explosive on a cave mouth where a machine gun had started up again. Thomas listened, translated the request into the Navajo code he had carried in his head for 2 years, and spoke into the handset in a steady, almost flat tone. Even when shells landed close enough to shower them with splinters of rock and steel, he tried to keep his voice level because he had learned early that fear showed up in the way words stumbled. The other Marines listened too, not understanding the language but watching his face as he sent and received. When he nodded and relayed the English reply, they moved with a little more certainty, as if the calm of his voice had drawn a line through the chaos that told them someone further back knew where they were and what they needed. Elsewhere along the beach and inland, other Navajo voices were doing the same work. The Marine Corps had spread teams of code talkers across all 3 divisions on Iwo Jima, placing them with artillery battalions, regimental headquarters, and frontline units that were expected to move fast and face sudden counterattacks. Since 1942, the code talkers had proved themselves in major battles across the Pacific. On Guadalcanal, where the first group had been tested in combat, their ability to send accurate fire missions in minutes rather than the half-hour or more needed by standard codes had impressed even skeptical officers. Later, during the campaigns on Bougainville, Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian, their messages had directed naval gunfire, coordinated close air support, and helped sort out units scattered in jungle or shattered by night attacks. The training they had received at Camp Pendleton and other bases emphasized not only the mechanics of the code but the discipline to stay on the air even when exhausted, hungry, and under fire. Marine communications officers compared them with other cipher systems and found that a Navajo team could encode, send, and decode a 3-line message in about 20 seconds compared with a half-hour, or more for a message encrypted with a machine or a code book. In a war where artillery barrages and airstrikes needed to be adjusted in real time as enemy positions shifted, that difference meant fewer friendly casualties and more broken enemy defenses. Japanese intelligence units recorded the strange language they heard on the American nets, sent it to their own experts, and even attempted to cross-reference it with prisoners and captured documents. But the combination of an unwritten language, a small pool of fluent speakers, and the extra layer of code built onto it defeated every effort. While Japanese cryptanalysts succeeded in breaking some Allied codes and gained useful intelligence from them, they never broke the Navajo system. In later testimony, Marine signal officers would state plainly that during the entire war, there was not a single documented case of the Navajo code being compromised. In the brief pauses between calls, Thomas sometimes thought back to a very different kind of noise, the sound of English words shouted in a classroom, and the sharp sting of a strap when a boy answered in Navajo. He had been born in the early 1920s, when government policy pushed Navajo children into boarding schools, often far from their families. At one such school, he was given a new name and new clothes and told that his language and traditions had to stay outside the gates. Speaking Navajo in class or on the grounds meant punishment, sometimes a beating, sometimes being made to scrub floors or write lines until midnight under the glare of lights that never dimmed. Yet the language held in quiet corners. Boys and girls whispered to one another in Navajo at night when the supervisor's footsteps faded, and elders at home still told stories in the old words when they came back in summer. When recruiters came during the early years of the war and spoke of a special duty for men who spoke Navajo fluently, Thomas felt both suspicion and curiosity. To many on the reservation, the United States government had been at best a distant authority and at worst an agent of harm. But the attack on Pearl Harbor and the stories that trickled back from men who had already joined changed the shape of duty. Families held meetings, elders spoke, and some of the young men decided that if there was going to be a fight, they would bring their language with them on their own terms. At Fort Wingate and other recruiting points, doctors checked their lungs and hearts. Clerks wrote down their names in spellings that often bore only a faint relation to the pronunciations their families used, and then they boarded buses headed west. The sea they saw at San Diego was the first many had ever seen, and boot camp quickly narrowed their minds to the things the Corps cared about: how fast they could run, how straight they could shoot, how quickly they could learn to obey and to think for themselves at the same time. The summer and fall of 1943 for him were a map of training grounds and classrooms rather than battlefields. At Camp Pendleton, above the breaks of the Pacific, Thomas woke to bugle calls and the bark of drill instructors, marched through dust on long hikes with a rifle cutting into his shoulder, and learned to fold his gear into a tight, exact bundle that could be checked in seconds. After basic training, he was selected for the signal section and paired with other Navajo recruits in classes that took place in small, plain rooms with blackboards and simple tables. There, under the supervision of Marine officers and senior Navajo code talkers from the original group of 29, he learned the structure of the code. The system used Navajo words for animals, natural objects, and familiar items to represent letters of the English alphabet. For example, the Navajo word for ant could stand for the letter A and bear for B, but there were alternate terms too, to avoid patterns. On top of this alphabet layer, there was a growing list of entire words assigned Navajo equivalents for military terms that appeared often in messages. Submarine, battleship, fighter, bomber, regiment, machine gun, hand grenade each had a coded Navajo term that did not match its literal meaning. So a tank might be called a tortoise, a battleship a whale, and a grenade a potato, all in Navajo. The goal was to make the code both fast and hard to guess. Code talkers memorized these lists through repetition, reciting them to one another, turning drills into songs, and by the time Thomas had finished his course, he could take down sentences of military English and return them in code with no pauses. In field exercises at Pendleton, he and his classmates practiced during mock assaults. They ran up dry hillsides while artillery simulators burst, found cover behind rocks, and sent practice fire missions in the code while instructors marked their time with a stopwatch. At the end of a message, a senior Marine would compare what the receiving team had written down with the original, and the rare misstep meant extra drilling. That discipline, pressed into muscle and mind in California, followed him all the way to the black sand of Iwo Jima, where the noise was no longer simulated, and each correction he sent could be the difference between a well-placed barrage and shells falling short on Marines struggling forward. By the time he reached Iwo Jima in early 1945, the Pacific War had carved a bloody path across a vast arc of ocean and land. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway had broken the expansion of the Japanese fleet, and in August that same year, American Marines had landed on Guadalcanal, beginning the first major offensive against Japanese-held territory. The strategy that followed, often called island hopping, aimed to seize key islands and bypass others, building airfields and naval bases that would squeeze the Japanese home islands and cut off their supply lines. In November 1943, American forces took the Gilbert Islands, including Tarawa, at terrible cost. In 1944, they moved into the Marshalls and captured Kwajalein and Eniwetok, then advanced to the Marianas, taking Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Each campaign added to the chain of airstrips that allowed long-range bombers to reach further into Japanese-held airspace. As American forces drew closer, Japanese defenders often fought to the last man, and battles like Peleliu and Saipan became symbols of fierce resistance and high casualties on both sides. In this context, Iwo Jima was both a stepping stone and a shield. Its airfields lay roughly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, and Japanese fighters based there could intercept B-29 bombers heading to and from the home islands. The island also provided early warning of raids. American planners believed that capturing Iwo Jima would eliminate that threat and provide a haven for damaged bombers returning from missions over Japan. The cost was expected to be high. Intelligence estimated several thousand defenders in fortified positions. In reality, more than 20,000 soldiers and sailors were dug into the island. As the invasion force assembled, logistics officers counted not merely men but the mountains of supplies needed fuel by the millions of gallons, ammunition by the thousands of tons, rations to feed tens of thousands for weeks, and medical supplies for casualties expected to number in the many thousands. Inside that vast ledger, the code talkers were a tiny line item, barely noticed, yet their performance on earlier islands had already shown that they could compress the time needed to move those supplies where they were most needed and to put shells and bombs where they would do the most damage to a determined, hidden enemy. For Thomas, life on the island after the first week blurred into a pattern marked more by voices than by dates. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi on February 23rd was something he saw at a distance, a tiny cloth shape lifting on a pole against the sky while smoke still pulsed from caves and trenches below. He heard the cheer roll across parts of the line, but in his sector they were already dealing with new orders, new targets, new losses. The northern half of Iwo Jima was a maze of formidable positions with Japanese names his tongue did not know, rough ridges and rock formations that American maps labeled with nicknames like the Turkey Knob and the Amphitheater. Mortars and artillery hidden in these features fired into American positions with deadly accuracy, and the Japanese defenders used tunnels to appear suddenly in the rear or to shift from one firing point to another while remaining under cover. This made communication vital. When a platoon reported that it was being flanked, headquarters needed to know exactly where, and senior officers needed to move reserve units and supporting arms with precision, not guesswork. Thomas worked through these demands, often as the one unmoving point in a temporary command post, his back against lava rock, the radio set humming beside him. He sent messages that relayed reports of casualties and requests for stretcher bearers, noted where water had run low, passed along warnings about minefields in broken English that had to be rendered clearly in Navajo, and then into English again down the chain. Sometimes he spoke with another Navajo code talker yards or hundreds of yards away, and in those brief exchanges of their shared tongue, even wrapped in code, there was a reminder of home that eased the strain for seconds. At night, when flare bursts lit the sky and artillery traded across the island, he kept listening, headset pressed to his ear, ready to shift from rest to alert in the length of a crackling word. Outside the cratered ground where he worked, events moved with grim arithmetic. Over the 36 days of fighting on Iwo Jima, nearly 70,000 Marines and attached sailors fought, and almost 7,000 of them were killed. More than 19,000 were wounded. Japanese casualties were even higher. Out of roughly 21,000 defenders, only a few hundred were taken prisoner. The rest were killed in action or died by suicide as their positions were overrun. The island itself became a symbol of the harsh final phase of the Pacific War, where the pattern of fierce resistance on small islands raised urgent questions about the potential cost of an invasion of the Japanese home islands. This reality informed planners as they discussed operations later that year and eventually weighed the use of atomic bombs. Within the narrow sphere of communications and intelligence, the performance of the Navajo code talkers on Iwo Jima reinforced a lesson that had been building since 1942. The right human tool at the right moment could do what machines and books could not. Marine leaders took note of the more than 800 error-free messages sent by Navajo teams in the first 2 days alone and used that success to argue for continued development of similar special units. At the same time, the secrecy around their work remained strict. Many code talkers were told not to discuss their role, even with family, and official recognition was delayed for decades after the war. The code itself stayed classified long after the last shot was fired on the island where Thomas had sat with a handset in his hand and sand in his teeth, speaking words that crossed from one world into another and returned as steel and fire. When the order finally came for him to leave Iwo Jima, Thomas felt both relief and a strange emptiness. He had spent weeks measuring his days by the flow of messages and the rise and fall of gunfire, and stepping aboard a ship to sail away from the Black Island felt unreal. On the voyage back, he thought more often about home and about the road that had brought him from a boarding school desk where Navajo words were punished to a battlefield where those same words, shaped into code, had become a weapon his enemy could not touch. He did not know yet what history would say about that code, or how long it would stay hidden, or how many people would someday sit in halls and listen to stories about the Navajo Marines whose voices had helped to push an empire back toward its own shores. He only knew that on that beach and in those blasted ridges, the work had felt necessary and exact. Each message sent and received had carried the same quiet weight, the weight of lives that hung on whether numbers and landmarks and directions made it through the roar of a war that spanned half the globe. Years later, when asked to sum up that time, he would say in simple words that the code was never broken, that it saved many Marines, and that he had done what he was trained to do. For now, as the ship's engines throbbed beneath his feet and the coastline sank behind him, he folded his hands, closed his eyes, and listened to the remembered cadence of syllables that had once helped guide shells and men through fire, knowing that they lived now as much in his memory as they ever had in the air over Iwo Jima. The first time he woke without the sound of guns in his ears, he thought for a moment that he had gone deaf. The ship's engine throbbed faintly through the steel deck, and there was a low murmur of voices nearby, but the sharp crack of rifles and the rolling crash of artillery were gone. Thomas lay in a narrow bunk, his boots on the floor, his pack at his feet, and for a few seconds he did not know whether he was on his way to another island or heading home. Then the sour smell of the black sand came back to him, the image of men moving up a slope under fire, and he remembered the order that had come down. His unit was rotating off Iwo Jima. He sat up, blinked in the dim light, and reached automatically for the radio handset that was no longer at his side. His fingers closed on empty air. The set was stored away in a compartment with other gear now, silent, its tall antenna unshipped. He felt oddly exposed without it, as if the thin wire and the small box of dials had been a shield of some kind. On deck, when he went up, the sea spread out in all directions, gray and cold, and the island lay behind them, a low, dark presence on the horizon. The air smelled of salt instead of sulfur. He stood at the rail and listened to the wind, and in his mind he could still hear the pattern of voices on the net, call signs, requests for fire, brief acknowledgments. The code was still there, every word of it, as firm as if it were written on the inside of his skull. He knew even then that he would carry it for the rest of his life. While he sailed away, the war did not pause. The fighting on Iwo Jima continued until late March, with Marines clearing the northern end of the island bunker by bunker, cave by cave, under constant risk of counterattack or hidden explosives. Even as the last organized resistance was crushed, American planners were already looking further west. The next target was Okinawa, a much larger island in the Ryukyus, with a civilian population of hundreds of thousands and a Japanese garrison that would eventually number around 100,000 soldiers. The invasion of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, and would stretch on for almost 3 months, becoming one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. There, too, Navajo code talkers went ashore with Marine units, sending messages that guided artillery and airstrikes over ground that turned into mud and ash under the weight of shells and rain. At sea around Okinawa, Japanese forces launched massed suicide attacks by aircraft known as kamikaze, sinking or damaging dozens of Allied ships and killing thousands of sailors. The scale of these attacks and the intensity of the ground fighting sharpened estimates about what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might cost. In Washington and in Pacific headquarters, officers studied casualty figures from places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa and wrote memoranda that spoke coldly of hundreds of thousands of Allied dead if landings were attempted on Kyushu and Honshu. Behind those numbers stood individual lives like Thomas's, lives that had already passed through fire once and might be asked to do so again. The Navajo Code, tested in battle after battle from Guadalcanal through Iwo Jima, was now a proven tool. Marine communications officers requested code talkers whenever they could get them. Japanese intercept units kept listening, kept recording, kept trying to make sense of the strange syllables that came and went on the air, but their reports contained only frustration. They could sometimes deduce that the speakers were Native Americans by accent or by scraps of information, and they knew the messages were important because of the traffic patterns, but they still could not read them. The code stayed unbroken. Thomas's path after Iwo Jima took him through a series of way stations that many servicemen knew. Hawaii, then stateside camps where men were rested, reassigned, or prepared for new operations. In Hawaii, he spent time in barracks where the sound of surf came in through the open windows at night, a softer rhythm than the pounding of naval guns. He and other Marines in his division underwent medical checks, cleaned weapons, and listened to rumors. Some said they were going to Japan itself. Others believed they might be sent to China or to the Philippines. To pass the time, he wrote letters home as best he could, describing only what the censors would allow. He could not write, "I sent messages that brought shells on enemy positions," or "I used our language in a way the enemy could not touch." So he wrote instead about the heat, about the sand, about friends lost and friends still alive. When he slept, he sometimes dreamed of turning the knobs on a radio set and hearing only silence, or of trying to speak and finding that no sound came out. During the day, when he drilled or cleaned gear, he still repeated parts of the code to himself under his breath, a private chant that kept the structure fresh. The code was still classified, and he had been given clear orders not to write it down, not to teach it to anyone not authorized, not to discuss it with strangers. This secrecy sat uneasily with him at times, because the language he was using had belonged to his people long before the United States existed. Yet he understood that in war there were things that had to be guarded, and the idea that an enemy might someday capture a written list and use it against his own side was enough to keep his mouth closed. In quiet moments he thought back to childhood, to the way elders had spoken of words as living things, and he realized that in this strange new role, the words he carried had found yet another life. In the wider world, as the summer of 1945 approached, the war reached a turning point that few at his level could fully see. In Europe, Germany surrendered in May after the fall of Berlin, ending the war there. In the Pacific, American bombers flew from bases in the Marianas, including Saipan and Tinian, over the Japanese home islands, dropping conventional bombs and later, new weapons whose power everyone would soon know. Naval blockades choked off supplies. Japanese cities burned under incendiary raids. Hundreds of thousands of civilians lost their homes and their lives. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. The scale of destruction shocked even some of the men who had worked on the project. In the days that followed, Japanese leaders debated surrender, weighing military pride against the reality of devastation and the prospect of more bombs. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito spoke on radio to the Japanese people, announcing that Japan would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. For Thomas, news of the surrender came not as a sudden speech from a radio in a quiet room, but as a wave moving through ranks and barracks. Men gathered around bulletin boards where orders were posted, listened to chaplains and officers explain that the war was over, and let out long breaths they had been holding for years. The sense of relief was mixed with grief for those who would not come home, and uncertainty about what would come next. Transport ships that had been preparing to carry men to new invasions now began loading for home or for occupation duty. Code talkers like Thomas were told that their code would remain classified, that they were not to share its details with anyone, not even with other Navajos who had not been part of the program. The irony was sharp. Their language had been suppressed in schools, then turned into a weapon, and now part of it would be locked away as a military secret. Demobilization after the war was a process measured in millions. Between 1945 and 1947, the United States reduced its armed forces from more than 12 million personnel to a fraction of that number, sending men back to cities, farms, reservations, and small towns in every state. Navajo code talkers returned along with everyone else, often with little outward sign of what they had done. Many received standard ribbons and campaign medals, but there were no special public ceremonies, no parades dedicated to their work. In some cases, even neighbors did not know that the quiet man down the road who herded sheep or worked in a trading post had once used his voice to guide fire onto enemy positions on distant islands. The code itself remained officially classified, in part because military planners wanted to keep the possibility of using it again if another conflict arose. Some Navajo veterans did, in fact, serve again in the Korean War, using the same code on frozen hills in a different part of the world. Through all those years, the code stayed unbroken and unwritten outside official channels. Japanese records examined after the war showed no success in decoding it. Intelligence reports described the strange language, noted its apparent Native American origin, and speculated about its structure, but admitted that without trained linguists and without a body of written material, there was no way to make progress. The strength of the code came not only from Navajo's unique sounds and grammar, but from the fact that it had been carefully adapted, standardized, and drilled into human memory rather than recorded. It was a code that lived only when spoken between men who had sworn an oath and passed through training. And when the last of those men one day fell silent, the code as a military tool would fall silent with them. He stepped off the train in the American Southwest wearing a uniform that already felt like it belonged to another man. The war had ended, the rifles were stacked in armories, and the flags that had flown over places like Iwo Jima were now folded in glass cases or carried in parades far from the smell of cordite and volcanic ash. Thomas felt the difference most sharply in the silence between sounds. No more coded call signs snapping over the net. No more artillery reports. No more naval guns thudding miles offshore. Instead, he heard the squeal of brakes, the murmur of families calling names on a crowded platform, and the thin note of a station master's whistle. His duffel sagged from one hand. The other, which had so often cradled a handset, now hung empty at his side. When he saw his family, standing a little apart from the crowd, he felt his chest tighten in a way the battlefields had never managed. His mother took his face in her hands, tears on her cheeks, and his father shook his hand with a gravity that said more than any speech. They spoke Navajo first, the way they always had, asking if he was well, if he was hungry, if his wounds hurt. He answered in simple phrases, leaving out details, because he had already been told in briefings that much of what he had done was classified. He could say he had been on an island called Iwo Jima. He could say he had carried a radio. But he could not say that his language had served as the spine of messages that moved entire battalions, or that an enemy had listened and never once understood. At dinner that night, with mutton and tortillas and coffee on the table, he listened to the soft, familiar cadence of voices around him and realized how much of the last 2 years had been spent taking that cadence apart, assigning it to alphabets and military terms, turning it into an instrument of war. Now, at home, he had to let the language breathe again as itself, with no grid coordinates hiding under it.